Here's Ben Shapiro to whine about how biased he thinks the political compass test is.
I think the premises of the questions are incredibly stupid. So let's just jump right in. Question number one, if economic globalization is inevitable, it should primarily serve humanity rather than the interests of transnational corporations. Did Bernie Sanders write this question? What a stupid ass question, seriously. Like transnational corporations, which are responsible through the use of free market capitalism for the dramatic decrease of poverty throughout humanity, are now opposed to humanity?
The question doesn't imply that these corporations are opposed to humanity. It only implies that the interests of humanity and the interests of these corporations are to at least some degree distinct. They don't perfectly overlap. It doesn't imply that they are diametrically opposed. Also, while by some measures the most extreme poverty, usually defined as people living on less than $1.90 a day, has declined, when you define poverty more broadly, the picture isn't as clear. Here's a chart of income quintiles in the US from 1999 to 2018. For all but the bottom 20% of incomes, the peak income was 2017 or 2018. But for those in the bottom 20%, incomes were lower than they were in the previous 19 years. Over that period, the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. Now, perhaps the economies worldwide are not as brutal as the American economy, so perhaps the bottom quintile worldwide isn't doing as badly, but this nonetheless illustrates that transnational corporations are not responsible for the decrease in poverty throughout humanity, because poverty hasn't decreased throughout humanity. For the bottom 20% of incomes in the US over the last couple of decades, it's increased.
Military action that defies international law is sometimes justified. Strongly agree. International law is a bunch of crap written by countries that generally have their own priorities. The UN Security Council includes Russia and China. So yeah, I'm going to go with strongly disagree, or strongly agree on we can sometimes defy the idiocy of international law, which is an idiotic construct in the first place.
If law can justly be violated due to the fact that those with whom you disagree are involved in the drafting of that law, wouldn't that justify violating domestic laws as well? How are international law and domestic law different in this regard?
There is now a worrying fusion of information and entertainment. Disagree. Disagree. The reason I say disagree is because there was always that fusion. We just ignored it until the last 5 minutes when everybody got mad because conservatives were suddenly creating news.
Suddenly, conservatives are creating news. The people reporting the news were never conservative before the last 5 minutes. And the trouble people have with Ben, Rush Limbaugh, Alex Jones, etc. is that they're conservative rather than because they consistently misinform and frequently defame people to sell snake oil like male vitality pills and Brain Force Plus.
Okay, the economy. People are ultimately divided more by class than nationality. Strongly disagree, and World War I proved that that's a bunch of nonsense.
You're going to have to unpack that a bit for me, Ben. How did World War I demonstrate anything of the sort? Wasn't World War I when the people of Russia decided to shift focus from fighting other nations to fighting their own domestic aristocracy? Is that really the time that demonstrated that people are not more divided by class than nationality?
Controlling inflation is more important than controlling unemployment. I agree with that, because you can't actually control unemployment. You can only provide the principles necessary in order for an economy to flourish. The only way to control unemployment directly would be through top-down government control, and you could have a horrible economy with complete employment. That was called the USSR or Cuba or Venezuela until the last 5 minutes.
Wait, which is it, Ben? Can you not control unemployment, or are the countries that do control unemployment doing something bad? Both can't be true at the same time. You can't say that controlling unemployment can't be done, then say that it's bad when it is done.
From each according to his ability to each according to his need is a fundamentally good idea. Strongly disagree, because need should not dictate either moral worth or the morality of the thing that you need.
This, I think, is the fundamental difference between right-wingers and me. I want all needs to be guaranteed as far as is possible. I think it's less immoral to take $5 from a billionaire by force to feed a starving person than it is for that billionaire to allow that starving person to die. Ayn Rand pejoratively called this stance the worship of the zero, because it prioritizes eliminating suffering over increasing joy, getting rid of negatives more than increasing positives. In Atlas Shrugged, Rand says that by this view, luxury shouldn't be pursued till the Cambodians have been fed and the Patagonians have been sent through college. She presents this as a bad thing, but when I read it, I was like, well, yeah, that makes all the sense in the world. All alternative ethical views seem to me to range from psychopathy at best to outright sadism at worst. Now, I'm a social democrat. I don't even oppose inequality per se, as long as those at the bottom of that inequality are unconditionally guaranteed at least the bare necessities.
It is regrettable that many personal fortunes are made by people who simply manipulate money and contribute nothing to their society. Again, the premise of that question is so ridiculous. A lot of the time when people people suggest that people are just manipulating money. What they are actually doing is mitigating risk and assessing risk and providing capital and liquidity markets that allow you to go out and spend on your company, on your business, or allow you to have a credit card, for example. So I'm going to go with disagree on that one. Maybe strongly disagree.
I suspect that what this question has in mind is things like housing speculation. When people buy houses and instead of living in them or even necessarily renting them out, they will just let them sit there empty for decades and sell them at a higher price later. How does that benefit anyone other than the speculator?
Protectionism is sometimes necessary in trade. Agree, but only for national security reasons. So maybe disagree? Maybe I'll put disagree, because it's generally not necessary in trade. It's only necessary for national security reasons. It's not necessary for economic reasons.
In that case, Ben should be fully supportive of, for example, a country nationalizing its oil industry and kicking out foreign-owned oil companies that pose a threat to its energy independence, and opposed to all of the CIA operations that stage coups against any country that tries that. A country having control over its own energy supply is a genuine national security issue. But if that means kicking out American oil companies, conservatives call it communism, from which that country must be liberated.
The only social responsibility of a company should be to deliver a profit to its shareholders. Agree. Agree. That's what a company is designed to do. It's designed to provide a profit to its shareholders, and that has a bunch of ancillary benefits. It's not designed for employment. It's not designed for redistribution.
I suspect that what the person who came up with this question had in mind was not to ask whether companies ought to take responsibility for providing employment or redistribution, but rather that they ought to take responsibility for any negative effects they may cause. Should a company be held responsible if it makes a car that spontaneously combusts, or should the buyer simply beware?
The rich are too highly taxed. Strongly agree. And by the way, I agreed with this when I was making 50, 60 grand a year. Of course the rich are too highly taxed. On a net basis, the rich are paying for nearly everything in the country right now via taxation.
Until everybody is unconditionally guaranteed a roof over their head and enough food and medicine to survive, the rich are not taxed enough.
Those with the ability to pay should have access to higher standards of medical care. Well, again, the phraseology of the question is so ass backwards because, again, the question isn't whether those with the ability to pay should have access to higher standards of medical care. The question is whether a system that allows people to pay for better medical care also allows people who are poor to get better medical care. Meaning that when rich people pay more for medical care, where do you think that money goes? It goes into the medical system and is then reinvested in drug development, reinvested in medical innovation. So the answer is agree. But again, you can tell who wrote these questions. These questions are obviously written by people who are very much of the political left.
Unless the money that rich people pay for better care goes to make care for everyone else entirely free of charge, then no, they shouldn't be able to purchase better care.
The freer the market, the freer the people. Strongly agree.
There are many people who lived in Chile in the 70s and 80s who would not agree.
An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. What? One of the great misnomers in all of biblical history is the notion that an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth is meant to be taken literally. There's entire swaths of the Talmud dedicated to discussing the fact that this is meant in terms of monetary pricing, that the cost of an eye should be repaid by compensatory damages. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, disagree.
A big misconception is that anything in the Bible should be taken literally, even the stuff that's intended by the authors to be taken literally. And whether we're talking about literal eyes and teeth or just their value, the principle either way is that punishment ought to be proportional. So when you disagree, Ben, are you disagreeing with that principle?
Those who are able to work and refuse the opportunity should not expect society's support. Strongly agree.
This is more of Ben's work or starve morality. Any circumstance in which the alternative to working is homelessness and starvation is not a circumstance in which someone is free, especially if the work involves obeying the orders of an employer.
Abstract art that doesn't represent anything shouldn't be considered art at all. Agree. If you give me a blank canvas and tell me that it's art, you're an idiot.
I'm curious as to what Ben thinks art is. It seems to me that art is anything that expresses an idea or sentiment. If you hang a blank canvas in a gallery next to a bunch of paintings, you are implying something by doing that. Ben might not like what such an act implies, but since it does send a message, it is art. Also, the question asked about abstract art in general. Why wouldn't abstract art be art? Say someone designs neckties. Usually neckties don't depict anything. They have stripes or polka dots or paisley or some such abstract pattern. Is a person who designs such neckties not an artist in some sense?
It is a waste of time to try to rehabilitate some criminals. Strongly agree. Obviously, there are recidivism rates that are extremely high.
Even if there are people who will remain dangerous no matter what you do to try to rehabilitate them, it's always worth trying because there's no way to know beforehand whom we can rehabilitate and whom we cannot.
Charity is better than Social Security as a means of helping the genuinely disadvantaged. Agree.
If charity were better at helping the disadvantaged than Social Security, people who were over 65 before Social Security existed would have all received charity checks that were consistently bigger than the Social Security checks people over 65 get now.
It is important that my child's school instills religious values. Strongly agree.
Well, wait a minute. 4 minutes earlier, Ben said this.
The prime function of schooling should be to equip the future generation to find jobs. Strongly agree. I think moral education is generally the preserve of the parents.
If moral education is generally the job of the parents, then why would it be important for schools to instill religious values?
To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.